Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas public lecture series. This is the inaugural Scholars in Psychology annual public lecture. I'm Professor Lisa Foer. I'm Head of School of Psychological Sciences, and I'm your MC for this evening. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the country on which we're standing and the country. We have a lot of online participants, but I will be focusing on Lutruwita. As a reflection of our institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and the Palawa people. The Palawa are the original and traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting today from Nipaluna, Hobart. We pay our deepest respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and those who did not make elder status. We acknowledge the deep history of storytelling, knowledge sharing, and caring for land, and we offer our deep admiration for those who have preserved language, Palawakani, ensuring the ongoing preservation of culture. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights. So I'd like to acknowledge and make a special welcome to distinguished guests. Vice-Chancellor Rufus Black is with us this evening. I believe our Executive Dean of the College of Health and Medicine, Professor Denise Fassett, is online and sends her apologies for not being here in person. And of course, our speaker of this evening, distinguished Professor Michelle Craske. It's a great honour to have you here. Thank you. Tonight is the inaugural public lecture that aims to celebrate great and emerging scholars in psychology. So, as we come together this evening to celebrate the achievements of our colleagues and learn about cutting-edge research, I'm reminded of how fortunate we are to be sharing this experience in person. The Island of Ideas series began in 2020 as a way of connecting our community and ideas while we were unable to host face-to-face events during lockdown. This free program continues in 2022 in the hope that we can continue to connect Tasmania's community and research to people across our regions and into a global network of ideas and emerging issues. These conversations are an important part of the university's role. Connection, collegiality, and community date back to our founding and are present in the core of our values. I'd like now to introduce Professor Rufus Black, our Vice-Chancellor, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa. And if I can start with adding my congratulations to Christine and Jamie, Lucy, Anna, Jolie and Amelia for your outstanding achievements. It's exceptionally well done. And it is really terrific to be in a room of kind of talented psychologists in the making and in our broader community, and people committed to the whole cause that we celebrate tonight. And it's not just a kind of pleasure to be amongst such company, but it's important because the mental health challenges that we face are some of the most profound that we have to tackle as a community. And when I reflect on the fact the World Health Organization predicts that by 2030, mental health problems will be the leading cause of mortality and morbidity globally, we are aware that we are in the face of a unique form of health crisis. Indeed, the proportion of Tasmanians reporting mental health conditions and behavioural conditions rising from it has steadily increased since 2001. And when we look across the island, the need for greater support is huge. And the School of Psychology is playing a big and important part in being able to tackle it. And that's something we also celebrate tonight. But we are aware that we do this in a period where that challenge keeps on rising. COVID has certainly been one contributor, and we know in our own community and around the world the impact that's had on the mental health of so many. But we also face, in a time with ever greater challenges, where inequality in its many forms, where entrenched disadvantage, where alienation and the ongoing impacts of colonisation and the intergenerational trauma it transmits all add to a growing burden of mental ill health. Of course, we'll always be needing to paying attention to those root causes, but just as much as we do that, we have to deal with the reality in front of us and work to make the lives better of those who are suffering. And if we think that after the pandemic, we now have over 64,000 Tasmanians self-identifying as living with a long-term mental health condition, that's more than 11% of the population whose lives are being disrupted. And who are deserving of a better quality of life, and which in so many cases we know if we had the right kind of care and support for them, we could provide. And that's why when this school is so committed to seeing more Tasmanians served, it's something I think we take pride in and recognise the importance of. Last year, our counselling team conducted over 4,500 appointments and helped nearly 1,400 students. To have our own school making that contribution, not just to a workforce, but to actual care, is something I take a great deal of pride in. I know many of my colleagues across the university do as well. And so it is that we introduce Professor Craske tonight. Her work is of enormous importance. Her leadership globally is of importance. And her own work, rolled out in students at her university at the beginning of the pandemic, when the need for services was acute, clearly was also a contribution in her own world to making that kind of difference that really and truly matters. So it is a great pleasure to be having her come and join us. And I should say a few words about all of the things that she has been doing. So she is Professor of Psychology and of Psychiatry and Behavioural Sciences, a Ph.D, the Kevin Love Fund Centennial Chair, Director of Anxiety and the Anxiety and Depression Research Centre, Associate Director of the Staglin Family Music Centre for Behavioural and Brain Health at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and she is co-director of the UCLA Depression Grand Challenge. She's published extensively in areas of fear and anxiety and depression, including over 570 peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as academic books, several self-help books, therapist guides, and is on the Web of Science most highly cited researcher list. She has been a recipient of extramural funding since 1993 for research projects about risk factors for anxiety and depression amongst children and adolescents, neural mediators of emotion regulation and behavioural treatments for anxiety disorders, fear extinction translation models for optimizing exposure therapy, novel behavioural therapies targeting reward sensitivity, and scalable treatment models for underserved populations. And as part of UCLA's Depression Grand Challenges, she developed the STAND program for screening, tracking, and treating anxiety and depression. And I gather we'll hear more about that tonight. She's the editor-in-chief of Behaviour Research and Therapy. And from our kind of pride comes from the fact that she received her Bachelor of Arts with honours from the University of Tasmania. So it is a real pleasure to be welcoming her home in the best sense of the word. And so I now welcome Professor Craske to the stage to deliver her lecture, The Mental Health Gap, Stand for the Future. Thank you, Michelle.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and talking about the mental health gap. So I want to begin by recognizing that we do indeed face an enormous challenge. So we do face an enormous challenge in terms of mental health worldwide, but I do believe that there is a way forward in terms of making therapeutic interventions more effective and making them more available to those who are in need. But let's begin by talking about the size and scope of the problem. Depression and anxiety are among the most common mental health conditions, and they affect as many as 1 in 3 persons at some time in their lives. And while rates vary country by country and region by region, typically women are at greater risk than men, and 16 to 24-year-olds are at greatest risk, and the rates are increasing even before the pandemic. Now, these mental health conditions affect our entire social and economic fabric, extending from family and social relationships to education, where they predict dropout from higher education, to career paths, where they're associated with job loss and unemployment, and to health, where depression and anxiety not only influence health, but are influenced by health in a reciprocal cycle. And so for all of these reasons, as was already mentioned, depression and anxiety are among the leading causes of disability worldwide and projected to become the major contributors to global disease burden by the year 2030. And at the center is the life of the individual who is suffering from these conditions. Depression, for example, is the leading cause of suicide, which ends the life of over 800,000 individuals each year, more than war, homicide, and natural disasters combined. And yet, less than 1/2 of individuals receive any kind of treatment. And that's in high to middle income countries, including Australia. And in less resourced countries, of course, the rates are even lower. And when treatments are provided, they currently work about only half of the time. And so, yes, we face an enormous challenge. Now, one of the major reasons for this upper limit on the effectiveness of existing treatments is that we don't fully understand the causes of these problems. And the result is that our treatments are a little bit like throwing a dart blindfolded. We don't precisely know what it is we're trying to hit. And so one of my research goals over the last many years has been to gain a better understanding of what causes depression and anxiety so that we can develop laser-targeted and more effective treatments. So I'm going to begin by giving you some exemplars of my research in this way, and then I will discuss how to make these treatments more accessible to those in need. So let's begin first by focusing on fear and anxiety. Now, we all experience fear and anxiety to some degree, often in response to stresses or financial pressures, but usually that fear subsides. And my own research has focused on what makes some people more vulnerable to fears emerging more strongly, spreading more widely, and persisting over a longer period of time to the degree that they interfere with functioning and become an anxiety disorder. And to do this, I evaluate the fundamental processes of fear learning, which are central to our survival. So we're going to take a little journey through what fear learning involves. When we experience or witness or even just hear about an innately aversive event, whether it be physical injury or social rejection, like being yelled at, we naturally search for the things that were associated with that event so that we can be more cautious and avoid them in the future. And this is a natural associative process by which we acquire fear. So in the depiction, the person will hold on to the memory of being yelled at by this person so that they can become cautious and more fearful of that person or the conditions that led that person to yell at them in the first place. And naturally, our fear response will generalize to other situations that resemble the one in which we were hurt. And we begin to associate them with the possibility of the harm happening again. So the person who was yelled at by a co-worker may start to fear and avoid other co-workers. And again, this is an adaptive survival strategy. We expect harm to occur in situations that were similar to the one in which it actually did happen, so that we can be cautious about them in the future. But over time, and with continuing experience, we adapt. So either the danger, the harm reoccurs, in which case fear and avoidance would be the most adaptive strategy, or we gather information to the contrary to realize that the harm doesn't reoccur or rarely reoccurs in the situations in which we had expected it. And over repeated disconfirmatory experiences, we develop a new set of associations in our mind that in the depiction that these co-workers won't yell or criticize. And this is called short-term fear extinction. So we become less fearful and less cautious. And these extinction patterns are also adaptive because our life goals, career advancement or social relationships, will be unnecessarily impaired if we continue to avoid situations that are actually no longer harmful. However, that extinction process is a little bit more tenuous than the original fear acquisition. So it won't generalize as widely. So we're not as easily going to learn to be less anxious in situations that were similar to the one in which we just experienced. And I'll come back to that later. So these are natural fear learning processes that we all go through. But for some people, those who are more prone to developing anxiety problems, we see that fear is acquired more strongly, it generalizes more widely, and it persists for a longer period of time, related to more avoidance and weaker extinction. And I'm going to present a few examples from my research. Now, in these studies, we do use a very mild electrical stimulation that's uncomfortable but not painful. It's a bit like a pinch, as the experimental parallel of being yelled at by somebody. So you'll see me referring to shock with consent from participants. So I want you to imagine for a moment that you're 16 years old. You're sitting in this laboratory. You have electrodes around your left eye. And those electrodes are going to measure the size of the blink of the eye, which is an excellent measure of defensive responding to threat. You also have electrodes on your chest and your hand to measure sweat glands and heart rate. And then you have 2 electrodes on your arm. And you're told that when this screen appears, you may receive a shock through those electrodes on your arm. And if the shock is going to happen, it will happen in the last 10 seconds of that countdown. And that screen alternates with this screen, which says you're safe. When this screen is on, no shock will be given. And these 2 screens alternate back and forth a number of times, and right in the middle of the experiment, in the 4th red danger screen, you do receive that mild electric shock. Now, we then evaluated how people respond to these red and green screens and whether it predicts the development of their anxiety over the next few years. Everybody responded to the red screen. Their eye blinks were massive because when that red screen was on, threat was imminent. It could happen at any second. And so defensiveness was really elevated. What differentiated those who went on to develop anxiety disorders over the next 4 years and more widespread fears over the next 6 years is an elevated defensiveness to the green screen, to the thing that should have been safe. It's as if that one mild shock led the persons who became anxious in the future, led them to treat everything surrounding it as threatening. And it would be the same, it would be akin to the experience of being yelled at by one coworker, leading to fears of all the other co-workers, including the friendly people in the office. And that pattern of overgeneralized fear responding would likely explain why these individuals develop more anxiety and fears over the next few years. And we've observed the brain regions that are associated with this overgeneralized fear response in our functional magnetic resonance imaging studies. And the particular region that we've identified is called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is an area that regulates emotions and the expression of emotions. And what we've observed is that with repeated trials of a particular symbol, shown here as a yellow lamp, that is paired with a mild electric shock, versus repeated trials of a completely different symbol, the green lamp, that's never paired with shock. Okay, we've got these two types of trials. Those individuals who subsequently went on to develop more fears over the next 2.5 years, for those individuals, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex failed to differentiate it. It treated these as the same thing. It responded in the same way. It's as if the brain's neural systems was failing to differentiate between what was safe and what was dangerous, who was a bully and who's a friend. And that is why the fears spread. And so what this means clearly is that when we think about prevention, how do we prevent the development of anxiety disorders? In the past, we used to think about, let's teach people to be less fearful of threatening things. What these data are saying is, no, what we actually need to teach is, particularly children, because that's where these anxiety disorders typically first emerge, we need to teach them how to discriminate what is safe and what is dangerous, and how to regulate their emotional response to safety. And that's a very different way of thinking about it. Now, we also know that once hurt, anxious individuals are much more prone to avoid, even at a cost. For example, they might avoid social situations because they're afraid of being rejected, even though those same situations could offer the possibility of a job. And avoidance literally prevents extinction from taking place, because there's no new learning that the danger has actually gone. It's not reoccurring. And so, because of avoidance, fear persists. So the obvious treatment implication here is to help people replace avoidance with exposure, to help the socially anxious person get back into the social group, or to help the person who's fearful of spiders, and this is one of the spiders in our lab, Pepe, to help the person get back into holding the spider to learn that it won't bite. However, we've also found that individuals who are at risk for anxiety or who have anxiety disorders have difficulties extinguishing their fear. They remain fearful despite the evidence to the contrary. For example, children who are at risk for anxiety by virtue of their parents having anxiety or depression, as well as children with anxiety disorders, remained fearful, and here we were measuring their sweat gland activity, they remained fearful of the yellow lamp, even though there were all those trials where the yellow lamp was no longer associated with a loud bell. Of course, we're not going to shock children, so it's the loud bell, okay? It's as if they're remaining fearful despite the fact that the yelling has stopped, if we look back to those depictions that I showed earlier. And in our neuroimaging research, we've identified the brain regions involved in that, such that young adults who become more depressed or anxious over the last 2.5 years show an underactivation in a brain region called the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, which is another region involved in emotion regulation. So those who had become more anxious or depressed showed underactivation in that brain region as they were going through these repeated trials to illustrate that the lamp no longer meant they were going to be shocked. It's as if, again, the neural brain systems were not engaged in the normal emotion regulation processes that are involved in fear extinction. And this is probably why they became more anxious and more depressed. So what do these data say? These data suggest that simply helping people to face the situations that they've become afraid of is not going to be enough, because they have deficits in the extinction process. They don't take that information to learn that the danger has gone. And so that's probably one of the reasons why only 50% of people respond to standard exposure therapy treatments. So my research has focused on ways of augmenting the process of fear extinction throughout exposure therapy and trying to make these treatments more effective. And I'll just give you a few examples. For example, we design exposures to generate what is called prediction error. And that's the motor, that's the engine of extinction learning. In general, we all learn most when what we predict will happen in a given situation is dramatically different from what actually happens. We learn by surprise. We don't learn when what happens exactly matches what we thought. And that's true for extinction learning too. Extinction is magnified when the person's expectancy mismatches with the outcome. And so what does that mean for if we translate it to exposure? It means we establish the conditions under which the person expects to be harmed, knowing secretly that they won't be, but they expect it. And then we guide them through exposure to those conditions and then help them fully appreciate the difference between what they expected and what actually happened. So if the person here said, I really think the spider's going to bite me or climb in under my clothing and wherever in my body, if I hold it for more than 2 minutes, then we'll do the exposure for more than 2 minutes. We're not going to do the exposure for less than 2 minutes because that won't lead to any prediction error. And we've found that the degree of prediction error that happens, we measure it before and after exposure, is a predictor of better symptomatic outcomes in the long term. We've also found that if we attend to and label emotional experiences during the exposure, we can add or augment the prediction error and lead to long-term better outcomes. So as the person here is going through exposure to holding the spider, we'd be encouraging them to say, I feel anxious, I feel nervous, my heart is racing, but I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep doing this exposure. The same thing happens with trauma memories. And in fact, what we have found here is that when we have individuals who've been traumatized in combat zones, repeatedly label the emotional experience to the memories of that trauma, that process not only lessens their symptoms of PTSD, it also changes their brain response to similar kinds of images in the future, where they show less amygdala response, which is the threat detection system of the brain. We can also augment, and all of these studies I'm presenting in our randomized controlled trials, we can also augment that prediction error by doing multiple stimuli at the same time. So not exposure to one spider, but 2 spiders at the same time. And maybe it'll make more sense if I describe it in terms of social anxiety. So if the socially anxious person says, I think I'm going to be rejected if I ask somebody to help me. I also think I'm going to be rejected if I offer to help somebody else. In that case, the best exposure is to do them both together. So the person would ask for help and offer help as depicted in this diagram, because the combination is going to generate greater prediction error than either alone, and therefore better learning and better outcomes. Now, despite successful extinction or successful exposure, we always remember the hurt experiences. They don't go away. And we remain vulnerable to the memories of being hurt, returning at a later point in time. They return with the passage of time. So in this example, if somebody had taken extended leave from work and then came back, their memory of the trauma is likely to reoccur. They also resurge with change in context. So if the person who had been yelled at work learned that not everybody yells, they're doing well, and then they go into a brand new job with a brand new set of co-workers, there's a good chance that that memory of being yelled at will return. And so I've looked at ways of offsetting those long-term returns of fear. And so one example is that we have found that mental rehearsal, where we have people rehearse the prediction error 4 hours later, 12 hours later, or 24 hours later, and 48 hours later, to consolidate that memory actually helps in the long term compared to control conditions. And here's the example that I was referring to before about the change in context. If all of the therapy is done in one exposure context, it won't readily generalize to new contexts. Remember, I said before, extinction is tenuous. It won't easily spread. So what do we do to offset that context effect? How do we help people take what they learned in therapy and bridge it over into these new contexts? And we've tested a number of different ways of doing that, such as retrieval cues or just practicing in as many contexts as possible. And the latest way that we've done is to use a pharmacological agent. So based on some basic experimental research, which has shown that the brain region that's responsible for constraining extinction to the context in which extinction took place so that it does not generalize is the hippocampus. And scopolamine, a fairly benign drug, has a temporary interference effect on the hippocampus. So what we did is, in a randomized controlled placebo study, we used scopolamine as people went through repeated exposures to public speaking, 49 public speeches to be specific, and then tested the effect of the scopolamine when they went into a brand new context later on and found a benefit. And in fact, 1 month later, they were doing a lot better. So these are just some of the examples of how a more precise understanding of the causes of these conditions and the fundamental processes of fear learning can help us design treatments that are more precise, more targeted, more effective. But let's turn to depression. Most treatments for depression focus upon reducing negative emotions, sadness, guilt, anger, worthlessness. But there's now good evidence for the role of positive emotions. So, for example, not only high levels of negative emotionality, but low levels of positive emotionality, and those two things are not on the same continuum. They're two separate constructs. So low levels of positive emotions is actually a predictor over the next 6 years of who develops not only a depressive disorder, but also the two most common anxiety disorders. Furthermore, negative interpersonal stress, which increases the risk for anxiety and depression, can be buffered or reduced by high positive emotionality. In addition, controlling for all other variables, high levels of interpersonal support, which is a primary pathway for feeling positive emotions, reduces the risk for depression and anxiety. And acknowledging that every stressful life event is actually a complex phenomenon. It's made up of both positivity and negativity. So when a relationship ends, it can be stressful, but it can also be relieving, right? So if we independently rate the positivity and the negativity, we find that the positivity predicts the odds of depression, reduces the odds of depression, and the positivity also reduces the odds of anxiety disorders in the context of high negativity. So all of this to say that positive emotions and positive events seem to have a protective influence upon depression and anxiety, sometimes in interaction with negative events. So what is the mechanism? What's going on here? Well, various lines of evidence have shown that low positive emotionality, which is sometimes referred to as anhedonia, that means a diminished interest or joy in pleasurable activities. So low positive emotionality or anhedonia relates to undersensitivity to reward. Undersensitivity to reward. So what do we mean by reward? Reward can mean hedonic sensory pleasure, like enjoying a piece of chocolate cake. Or reward can be eudaimonic pleasure that comes from a sense of purpose or meaning, such as you might feel by helping others. And whether it's hedonic or eudaimonic, reward processing comprises a set of facets or processes. And a substantial body of research has shown that those who have low positive emotionality or anhedonia show less motivation for obtaining reward, less effort, less anticipation of reward, less wanting, less response to the attainment of reward, less liking, and less learning of reward or understanding, hey, if I do this, I will feel better. And that happens across a lot of different systems, the subjective experience, the psychophysiological response, even the brain response. For example, if we view these images, we typically subjectively experience the images as pleasant, maybe. We have an interest in seeing more. We probably have a little bit of a cardiac acceleration and an increase in reward neurocircuitry involving the ventral striatum and orbital frontal cortex, even to images involving money. But all of those responses tend to be blunted in persons with anhedonia or low trait positive emotionality. And so in our own research, for example, we found the subjective experience was reduced. It wasn't felt as pleasant. The attentiveness, they weren't attending as much to positive stimuli. We didn't see the cardiac acceleration, that little bump in the heart rate to these things. And we see less activation in the reward circuitry, particularly the orbital frontal cortex, which is involved in reward valuation and regulation of reward responses. And we've observed these effects in 18 to 19-year-old students, as well as in anxious and depressed primary care patients. So together, the evidence suggests that low positive emotionality is a risk factor for depression and anxiety, actually, and that deficits in these different elements of reward processing are characteristic or features of anhedonia and low positive emotionality. Okay, so that begs the question, how can we raise positive emotions in someone who has the deficits in reward sensitivity? And this is an important question because treatments to date, whether it's pharmacological or psychological, really have not been very effective at doing this. They've been okay at reducing negative emotions, but they have not been very good at increasing positive emotions. And in fact, what most people want is to feel more positive. And so we developed a new treatment called positive affect treatment, and it's comprised of a set of exercises which are all about increasing reward sensitivity. So we do behavioral activation to pleasurable activities combined with what we call memory specificity, where we actually train people to dig deep, slowly, and retrieve the memory of every moment that felt positive. What were they physically feeling? What did they see? What did they hear? And we combine that with cognitive training, where we help people to find silver linings, to imagine future events in a positive way, and to take ownership of positive outcomes where appropriate. And we combine that with cultivating positivity, where we practice intentions and actions of loving kindness, appreciative joy, generosity, and gratitude. So just to give you a little taste of this, I was going to do an experiment with you where I asked you to pull out your phones, but I think I'm not allowed to ask you to pull out your phones right now. So I want you to do it without your phones, but in your mind, identify someone who is very dear to you, someone who you really hold very dear. Maybe you haven't seen them in a while, maybe not. And I want you to take a few moments to take a mental note of a few words that you could say to them to show loving kindness, to wish them well, to appreciate them for who they are or what they have done, and to show your care and support. I'd like you to just take 30 seconds just to quietly imagine that person and just think what you would say to them. And I'll do the same. And maybe when the talk is over later on today, you could actually send a text. Now, that small act of kindness probably makes you feel a little bit good. Yeah. Maybe increases your heart rate a little bit, maybe lights up your ventral striatum, your orbital frontal cortex, makes you eager to see the person. For the individual who's been struggling with depression and anhedonia, when that's done at the right time, it is exceptionally powerful. It's uplifting and empowering for them. And of course, there's a major ripple effect upon the person who's the recipient of the message. So when we put all these things together, the behavioral activation, the cognitive training, and the cultivating positivity, we then compare this new treatment, this positive affect treatment, to standard psychological treatments for depression, anxiety. And here, that standard treatment is called negative affect treatment. So we have positive affect treatment in the blue line, negative affect treatment in the orange line. Both treatments lead to improvements, there's no doubt about that. But the degree or amount of improvement is significantly greater in both of our first study and our replication study, shown on the right-hand side. So you can see the blue line increasing, that's the amount of positive emotionality increasing over the course of treatment to a greater degree in positive affect treatment relative to this comparison treatment. Not only did it improve positive emotions more, which was our goal, it also was better at reducing symptoms of depression. It was better at reducing symptoms of anxiety, and it was better at reducing suicidality. Moreover, we did a number of tasks to measure those sort of constructs of reward attainment, reward anticipation, and so forth. And again, while both treatments made some benefits, the amount of change was greater in positive affect treatment. Those who went through that treatment showed a bigger increase in their anticipation of reward and their liking of reward across subjective measures, cardiac acceleration, and attentiveness. This may seem not that interesting, but it's actually a major achievement in psychological research to find one treatment doing better than another treatment. And we're doing further replication. Now, we have also expanded to use virtual reality as a way of administering some aspects of this positive affect treatment, which can be really helpful for individuals who've become so isolated or so unmotivated that it's very difficult for them to get out and do any of the activities that we talked about before for the reasons identified. So we have them practice virtual reality scenes, and then after they go through that virtual reality, to relive the experience and dig deep and find the moments that were most rewarding, most positive, and what did they feel in that moment. So I'm going to show you a little example. This is going to pale by comparison to immersive virtual reality, but it's the best I can do right now just to give you a little glimpse of being in that world. And what I want you to do as we go through this for a minute or so is just to pay attention to what you see, what you hear, and what you're feeling inside as you watch this. So you get the idea there, just skip back, you get the idea there of something very immersive. And just for a moment, just sort of think to yourself, if you can, just pull back what part of that, just to try to visualize for yourself, what did I see? What colors did I see? What sounds did I hear? What felt most pleasant in that moment? And that kind of reliving is the active part of the treatment in order to build that memory around those positive, rewarding experiences. And so what we do in virtual reality is we do these kind of scenes, we do lots of beautiful nature scenes, a lot of scenes about people being happy and enjoying life. We did find for some reason that Zoolander did not work. I don't know why, but did not work. I liked it though. I did like being in the center of you two singing to me. That was another good one. So we've found that these virtual reality scenes, if we do that time and time again, so we have them practice the scene, come back and think about what did I feel, and we follow it up with them practicing doing the same kind of memory for an autobiographical event. And that's all we did. 13 sessions of just that was very potent as a treatment for individuals who were severely depressed and anhedonic, even to the point of causing a change in their brain reactivity to a task of reward. Okay, now, this is all well and good. These are all treatments that we're trying to make more effective, but no matter how effective we make treatments, it won't make a difference if we can't get them out to the people in need. There'll never be enough clinical resources for the need. There'll always be personal or financial or other reasons why people don't go in to seek care from a clinician. So we definitely need alternative models. And that is the challenge that we've taken on at UCLA in the Depression Grand Challenge. And we believe that new technologies provide a key. That using the internet and smartphones, we can detect and actually deliver treatments for depression and anxiety and other related conditions on a scale and with a degree of personalization not previously imaginable. And so we've developed the UCLA STAND system of care, screening and treatment for anxiety and depression. This is a fully adaptive system that includes screening, treatment delivery, continuous monitoring, risk detection, social needs management, and treatment adaptation to change treatments as needs evolve over time. So specifically, individuals enter the system through a brief online survey, usually from their smartphones, that measures current symptom levels, your level of anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance use, psychosis. And then within minutes, they get a feedback about the level of care that would be most fitting for that symptom severity level, and they're routed to 3 tiers or 3 levels of care. For those individuals with very limited symptoms, they're provided an online cognitive behavioral therapy wellness program that we've developed, which has been shown to be effective in preventing the onset of depression and anxiety. For those who have mild to moderate depression or up to severe anxiety, we provide a set of online cognitive behavioral therapy modules, including the ones I've talked about, including the exposure that's based on augmenting fear extinction, including the behavioral activation with memory specificity training, as well as modules for sleep, trauma, worry. And those modules are then selected for the individual based on an embedded assessment system so that we can match the module to the person's needs. And it's all supported by a set of coaches who are trained and certified to support the digital therapy content. Why? Because having in-person touch makes a difference, particularly when people are dealing with real symptomatology. And they have supervision by licensed supervisors. And then those who are severely depressed, suicidal, having manic symptoms or psychosis, we refer them directly to in-person care. So we reserve the clinicians for those who have the most acute need, both integrated psychology and psychiatry. We provide continuous monitoring through the online survey that's done every week. And that continuous monitoring enables us to do several things. First, it enables us to do rapid outreach for suicidality. So anytime suicidality is endorsed, an automated alert goes to a 24/7 crisis team who reaches out to the person to conduct a safety check and safety action plan if needed. Second, that monitoring, that continuous monitoring, enables us to manage social needs, such as housing insecurity, food insecurity, financial stress, through the help of a social worker case management system. And third, that continuous monitoring enables us to measure how well the person is responding to the intervention they've been assigned to, so that we could rapidly adjust the intervention if they're not responding. So, for example, if somebody began in the online CBT with a coach, but their symptoms have worsened, we can rapidly move them up to a clinician. Or if somebody began with a clinician and they've improved, we can move them down to maintenance in the online therapy. So the treatment moves back and forth across these 3 tiers, from prevention to acute intervention to maintenance, in the same way that treatment is adapted to the changing needs for any chronic health condition. We have an IT infrastructure that combines the assessment data, the intervention data, and the clinical team, the coaching team, the risk management team, the case management team, and the administrative team. And this system has been implemented at UCLA for the UCLA students, where it's called the STAR Resilience Program. And it's now also being implemented in local community colleges in California, where rates of depression and anxiety are especially high. Life challenges like food and housing insecurity are as high as 50% of the students, and yet mental health resources are very limited. And we're also implementing it within the healthcare system, in particular, targeting perinatal mental health, and for which we've developed the online therapy modules to target that particular subgroup. So clearly, this system of care is developed with the idea of scalable and personalized. But I want to finish up by talking about where we're going. What are the next steps to make this even more personalized? First, through an ongoing centre grant, we're evaluating ways in which we make that clinical decision of which tier do people go into. So as I mentioned, currently, the tier assignment is all based on presenting symptom severity. But what we want to do is look at the whole contextual history or presentation of the person, not just their symptoms, but their life stress, their medical comorbidities, their neurocognitive functioning, their early adversity, their preferences and beliefs, and see if through machine learning modeling, we can find a better way of predicting who's going to respond best to each of those levels of care. It's certainly the case that there might be, for example, a severely depressed person who's going to respond just as well to digital therapy as they would to in-person care because they have great supports around them or because they have really strong preferences for digital therapy. So that's number one. Number two, we're now exploring digital behavioral phenotyping. This is looking at patterns of behavior in the natural environment like physical activity, sleep, social interaction, and autonomic state that we collect continuously over long periods of time from smartphones and Apple Watches and other wearable sensors. And these we think will be particularly helpful for the timing, for clinical decision-making about timing of interventions. As an example, sleep patterns may predict a tipping point in depression or anxiety that could trigger an intervention to prevent full relapse that would not be caught if you were relying solely upon visit-to-visit measures or even self-report. So to this end, we have a large study with the company called Apple, where we have recruited 4,000 individuals and we're monitoring them for 12 months in order to identify the digital behavioral phenotypes of depression and anxiety. And then also in another study looking through the Wellcome Leap, looking to see if the digital phenotyping relates to the brain. And finally, and this is the one that's furthest off in the distance right now, we want to expand upon our data-driven personalization. So as you heard me say, right now we typically assign the therapeutic module, whether it's exposure therapy or behavioral activation, based on the person's stated problem area. If they have anxiety, they get exposure. If they have sleep problems, they get the sleep module. We believe that we can use computational modeling from online tasks that measure aspects of reward processing and fear processing, similar to what I've discussed today, perhaps along with digital behavioral phenotyping, perhaps along with all those contextual factors that I mentioned before, like early adversity, to improve the precision of who is going to respond best to each therapeutic module within a tier, even to the point of which specific strategy within a module might be most effective for a given individual. Might be wishful thinking, but that's where we're going. So, yes, we have an enormous problem ahead of us. But I think there is a way forward with greater understanding of the factors that cause depression and anxiety and related medical conditions, that help us to inform more targeted and more effective treatments that can be tailored to the individual as their needs evolve over time and are scalable through digital platforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was wonderful. We have time for maybe a couple of questions.
I just noticed that the research is mainly based in Western countries, or so-called Western countries. How much research has been done in developing countries, please?
Yes, that's a really good question. Most of the research that I referred to, unfortunately, has been done in Western countries. I neglected to indicate that some of the work on the STAND system of care is being done right now on a smaller scale, in that we don't have all the tiers. We just have the digital therapy with coaching in a rural area of South Africa, where some colleagues of mine have been following a very large population subgroup. And in California, one of our community colleges is located in Imperial Valley, which is actually a highly impoverished area. But that being said, there's clearly a need for much more work in less resourced areas around the world. As you probably know, the World Health Organization has been really trying to maximize the implementation of digital therapies in under-resourced countries, definitely.
Okay, any more questions? Tash, we have a question from a student.
Yes, thanks. I'm just wondering, with the STAND system, is there some monitoring of clinician wellbeing? Because it seems that the clinicians are only dealing with some of the most extreme cases, and then they're not getting the reward of really seeing that client become well again. I'm just wondering if there is some monitoring of their wellbeing within that system.
I don't need to repeat that, right? Everybody can hear. Yeah. That's a really good question. I will say that in our data, the tier 3 severely depressed, on average, significantly improve over the course of 12 sessions. So, but not all, certainly not all. And there are some very, very chronic conditions there. And so the idea of having support for clinicians, frankly, is not something that we have done. But now that you've mentioned that, I will make sure that that is done, because I know that's a critical issue. We have a lot of supports in general, but nothing specifically around that, like the DBT model. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll take 2 more questions, one just here in the front and then another one up the back.
Thank you. Earlier in your talk, you referred to survival value and adaptiveness, so that put me in mind of Darwinism. And I'm wondering what Darwinian ideas, or perhaps evolutionary psychology, contributes to your area of research.
Yes, to the extent that my research is very much driven by animal models of threat imminence and predators and seeking of safety for protection, but not really beyond that, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, I think like with the reward system and the threat system, I'm thinking of them as basic survival motivational systems that are constantly working in synchrony with each other, you know, whether to avoid dangers or approach rewards. But that's about as far as I've gone. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Craske. You spoke about fear and anxiety caused by predictive error. But what about situations where there is no error? You know, people who are working in workplaces where bullying and harassment is pervasive, or people who are part of a discriminated minority, or
Yes.
people living in a flood-prone area, for example. And the kinds of treatments you've spoken about, can they be effective amongst those groups?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, you know, most of these treatments have developed from the expression of anxiety in situations where it's not necessary, right? But as I said, when danger reoccurs, then of course, continued fear and avoidance is the most adaptive strategy in those situations. then that raises the question, what do you do if somebody's living in those conditions? The treatment usually shifts more to problem solving and safety establishment. So it's a very different kind of treatment if somebody is continuing to exist in the environment where those kind of dangers persist. Definitely, yeah. It might also be the case that such individuals, and I'm sure it is the case that such individuals have a generalized fear response to other situations that are not harmful as a function of being in the environment that they're in. So this model would apply to the generalized fear, but not to the context. We're not going to have somebody who's in a domestic violence situation be repeatedly exposed to the the perpetrator, for example. Yeah.
And I might just, there's a number of questions online, a lot of them asking about how can we access STAND here in Tasmania. That might be a question that we discuss later with our clinical school colleagues.
Yes, so the whole STAND system of care was developed specifically to share. It's not a commercial product. It's a research structure that we want to be able to share with other places. It's really the mechanics. It's just the issue of the mechanics of it because it's a complicated system. But if you have a way of setting up the system that would enable this, we can certainly share it.
Wonderful. And I think now I'm going to invite the Vice-Chancellor back to the lectern to close out the evening.
Thank you, Lisa. As a way of concluding tonight, it's a special moment for us as a university. Each year, the university honours outstanding alumni who are making a difference to their communities here in Tasmania and around the world. We are fortunate in having a great array of alumni who make extraordinary contributions. And tonight we've heard from one of those. I always think the mark of greatness is when you can take the truly complex and make it remarkably comprehensible. And tonight we saw that in great spades, a field of enormous complexity distilled to its absolute essence and explained in ways that I think all of us could probably repeat to someone else afterwards. It's only the people at the very cutting edge of their field who can do that and take us on a journey that was full of the very kind of surprises, the disconfirmatory surprises, I think, that make such a difference. So tonight, that presentation alone gives you a hint of why the university has decided to recognise Professor Michelle Craske as our International Alumni of the Year Award. And it's my great privilege to be able to present that to Michelle tonight. And in doing so, also thank her for her great generosity, not just the kind of generosity we saw embodied throughout her lecture tonight, but also in what we observed earlier, her recognition by providing us a student prize to the School of Psychology to encourage other students to follow on that pathway of great distinction is just one of many ways, but one way in which you've been generous back to your alma mater. But tonight, Michelle, it is my great privilege to be able to recognise you as the university's International Alumni Award.
Thank you, Rufus, for presenting that, and thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful lecture, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. I recognise it's dinner time for a lot of people and you've all missed dinner. I hope you managed to get something earlier, and thank you everyone again. Thank you, Michelle.